thank you that this time we can work our brains out more to learn more on how to read and apply Old Testament narratives. We pray that as we learn, you will help us to apply these things in our daily lives so that we can have an increasing understanding of how you want us to live. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Like I said before, everyone loves stories. Put your hand up if you don't like stories. That's right. Everyone loves stories. Whether that be the latest Marvel movie, not TV series because the Marvel TV series are terrible, the latest gossip, funny stories, and etc. People love stories. And likewise, many, many years ago, the Old Testament people of Israel, they loved stories as well. In the whole Bible, the genre of narrative is actually the most common genre. Around 1/3 of the Old Testament is just narrative. And so learning how to read these different stories correctly will help us to understand what God is actually trying to say to us through the stories. There are narratives in the Bible, and God has put them so that we can read these stories, try to understand what these stories mean, and figure out what God is saying to us, speaking to us through those stories. Now, the purpose of Old Testament narrative, as you guys know, we're interpreting and applying Old Testament narratives, is to instruct and teach people about what godly lifestyle and action looks like. So that's like the main purpose. What that means is that many of the Old Testament narrative stories are actually not statistically accurate. Okay? Unlike most modern history books. Because when we read history books, they're all about being as accurate as they can, right? But Old Testament narrative, it doesn't need to be accurate. And this makes sense. Because the purpose is not to tell people exactly what happened, when, and where, and how, but rather it is to teach people what it looks like and what it doesn't look like to live a godly lifestyle and to obey God. What that means for us is that many Old Testament stories may actually not have happened in the exact way the Bible portrays it. Yeah. So while we recognize and acknowledge that these events themselves did indeed happen, but the way that it is portrayed in the Bible, probably not. Because the purpose is not statistical accuracy, but to instruct people to live a godly lifestyle. And so this is why many Christians believe that God did not in fact create the world in 7 days. Literal 7 days. And again, this is because the purpose of Old Testament narrative is to teach and instruct people how to obey God instead of teaching history. Is that cool? Awesome. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the different genres. Wait, sorry, how do you pronounce this word? Genres of Old Testament narrative. Okay? So, the different genres of Old Testament narratives. As you can see, there are many different types of genres of the Old Testament narrative. Some passages might include more than one in one text, and many actually interwove these multiple genres into one. Now, the name of all these genres, as you can see, depending on scholar to scholar, the name and the classification of these different genres might differ. Because we actually don't know what these genres are actually called. But what we do know is that there are many different genres of Old Testament narrative, and they needed a way to classify how to do so. So, the first type of genre that we're taking a look at, as you can see, is first of all, reports. Reports is the first genre, and below are the list of different kinds of reports in Old Testament narrative. So, what are reports? Reports are basically narratives that talk about an event or a situation that happened in the past. Usually, reports don't have any fancy literary styling, and they're very straightforward. Some examples of this include the tribal settlements of Canaan in Judges chapter 1, verse 16 to 17. the royal construction projects from 1 Kings 7, verse 2 to 8, and chapter 12, verse 25. And the different military campaigns in 1 Kings 14 to 25 to 26, and 2 Kings 24 to 20, verse 20. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 20 to chapter 5, verse 7. Of course, you can go through these again in the recordings. Oftentimes, report also talk about how a certain place acquired its specific name. For example, in Exodus chapter 15, verse 23, we see how that specific watering hole was named Bitter. Okay, so then, these are the different types of reports in Old Testament narrative. I'm going to just briefly go through them because, we don't need to spend too much time on this. Anecdotes. Anecdotes are basically reports that talk about an event or experience in the life of a person. It's kind of like a private biography. A good example of this is when Elijah summons Elisha to become his disciple. Battle reports. They're reports that basically talk about a war between two different nations or two different forces. Construction reports. It's pretty obvious. It's a report that talks about how certain important buildings were constructed, such as the tabernacle in Exodus and the temple in 1 Kings. Dream reports. They're basically reports told in either first or third person, and as the name suggests, it describes an individual's experience in a dream. Epiphany reports. These are reports where God or the angel of the Lord appears to someone, oftentimes conveying a certain message. Dream epiphany reports are kind of a mix between dream reports and epiphany reports. It's such as God appearing to Jacob in a dream at Bethel. Historical stories are basically reports written with a bit more literary elaboration than an ordinary report. They have a plot that usually goes from tension to resolution, have many dialogues and speeches by characters, and oftentimes include dramatic literary touches, such as Saul becoming king, Ahab's confrontation with the prophet Micaiah ben Imlah at 1 Kings, and Judges 9, verse 1 to 21. And then the next is history reports. History reports. And these are basically the book of Kings and Chronicles. They talk about history. Memoirs. Memoirs. They're reports that are written in first person about incidents in the life of an individual. Main purpose is to describe the era in which that specific person was living in. So as you can see, there are different kinds of reports in Old Testament narrative. You don't really need to know too much about them, but just good to know that there are different reports. So then, how do we interpret and apply these reports? So when we're reading this, how can we get any kind of use for us? There are, how many steps are there? There are, 4 steps. Step 1. For most reports, focus on the main subject of the report and how it adds to the themes of the larger context, whether that be the verse, the passage, chapter, or the book. And step 2, try to focus on finding out what the major themes are by the surrounding contexts. Passage, chapter, or book. Now, because reports usually focus on factual matters, like what happened, who did what, and etc., they actually don't provide very good devotional content. As in, we can't really get much out of them when reading it by ourselves. For example, in Joshua chapter 12, Joshua lists the Canaanite kings that God defeated to give Israel the promised land. And so when we're reading it, it just kind of sounds like, okay, we're just reading through the results of the battles and what kings were destroyed, And many people, when they read it, they say, okay, the main message behind this is, okay, don't go against God. If you read just chapter 12 alone, that's all you're going to get out of it. But from the surrounding context, especially from Joshua chapter 1 to 11, so all the chapters previous to chapter 12, the implied theological themes of Joshua 12, based on 1 to 11, are God has awesome power to help his people. God is a promise keeper. And God is worthy of Israel's gratitude and praise. So if you only read chapter 12, you're not going to get anything out of it. You have to read at least chapter 1 to 11 to understand why chapter 12 is significant. Now, but in regards to reports that are a bit more, when God is more present, like dream reports, the theological themes, you can find them immediately from that passage. For example, when Jacob in Genesis chapter 28, we see God stressing that he has a personal relationship with Jacob, and he assures him that he will be present with him on his journey. So the theme isn't found in front of surrounding context, but from the actual dream report itself. So it depends on the report. But the point is that oftentimes reports, because they're very factual, they won't give you much devotional content if you read it by themselves. You want to read it within the context of which it is placed in. Then you'll find out, okay, what does this mean for me? Step 3. Like any other narratives, reports usually make their points very indirectly. It's not very direct. So then, what we can do to counteract this is to ask ourselves questions such as, what is the text trying to say? And what are some subtle signs that the author has kind of hidden and woven within the text to convey a certain message? These are some questions that we can be considering as we read through reports. Now, in regards to history reports, like the Book of Kings and Chronicles, I'm sure most of you would have read it and be like, oh, the heck am I supposed to get out of this? It's just like history. Well, what we can do to get some good devotional content from these two books is to focus on what the two books are emphasizing and how they might differ or be similar. So, for example, the Book of Chronicles, if you guys read through it, it focuses more on Judah, David's support of Israel's worship, and the importance of the temple. So these are the three things that the Book of Chronicles focuses on over the Book of Kings. The Book of Kings, on the other hand, focuses on how David's rule of Israel was a spiritual disaster. And so the Book of Kings is kind of like, okay, don't be like David. Whereas the Book of Chronicles is kind of like, let's worship God because of the importance of the temple and blah, blah, blah. So to put it simply then, the Book of Kings focuses on how the Jews should avoid being like David and other kings when they return from exile. Whereas Chronicles focuses more on the encouragement to continue to worship and obey God even in the midst of exile. So as you can see, they have completely two different themes and purposes that they are addressing. And we can tell this by reading both of them and contrasting the two. So that's what you want to do when you're reading through like historical reports like the Book of Kings and Chronicles. So that's all just reports. It's very boring to read reports, and it takes a lot of effort to try to figure out what meaning I can get from reading these reports. But if you follow these couple of steps, at least you could find some devotional content for yourselves. But within Old Testament narratives, the even more common genre is the heroic narratives, and something you guys are probably more familiar with. Next slide, please. Yes, heroic narratives. And this is where, when we read through the Old Testament, we will get a bit more things to apply, get more things for the sake of us obeying God a bit better. Heroic narratives. So heroic narratives it's a genre that focuses on a series of episodes, focusing on a specific character, which we call a hero. Now, the reason why they're called a hero is not because they're like a superhero, but because they are considered as they are characters that are considered to be very important to the original audience. Now, a typical heroic narrative would include stories of the hero's birth, the hero's marriage, the hero's life work, and the hero's death. They place a lot of emphasis on how the hero lived and how we as readers should imitate these heroes. So heroic narratives, in most cases, they talk about good heroes and how we should copy or imitate how these good heroes obeyed God and lived a godly lifestyle. But there are also examples when heroic narratives use bad heroes. I know it sounds weird, but bad heroes, and how you should not live like this bad hero. Because by knowing what not to do gives just as important of a lesson for us as knowing what we should do. So there are cases of good heroes and bad heroes. So basically, follow the good heroes, don't follow the examples of bad heroes. Now, a really good example of heroic narrative is the life of Moses, which we see from Exodus to the book of Deuteronomy. We see his birth, marriage, vocation and calling, his work as a leader and a lawgiver, and ultimately his death. Moses' life also shows the struggles of the Israelites' national life and what it looks like to obey God as well. The book of Judges can be seen as a good example of a collection of heroic narratives as well. And they show the struggles of Israel from both inside, idolatry, and outside, from foreign invasions. So, what are some different types of heroic narratives? The first is called an epic. Very epic. Yeah. So epics basically represent a kind of like a subgenre of heroic narratives, and it focuses on the feats of the hero, what's another word? The successes of the hero, the works of the hero. And two traits and two features will set this apart from other heroic narratives. It's very long, usually, and it focuses on how important this certain hero is. And usually when the original audience, the Israelites, would read this, they're like, oh, this guy is like the nation's hero, like Moses. So the themes will be also very like large scale as well, like conquest, kingdom, warfare, and dominion. And because epics usually show how a certain nation came to be, it also has a lot of historical allusions as well. Okay, what are the different kinds of epics, as you can see on the screen? First of all, epics usually involve a lot of supernatural things, like supernatural setting, supernatural workings, and supernatural characters like angels. And usually, epics kind of focus on separate stories rather than like connected series. Some examples are Genesis, first of all, Genesis chapter 1 to 11, the first couple of chapters of the beginning of the Bible. It's an example of what we call a cosmic epic. Cosmic comes from the word cosmos, which means world in Greek. And you can see why it's called that, because it doesn't just talk about how a certain nation came to be, but how all of humanity came to be. There are also many different supernatural elements of Genesis chapter 1 to 11. For example, God directly participating with Adam and Eve in the garden, and with Noah in the flood. And the genealogies of Adam and Noah also show how the author of Genesis is very interested in how the nation of Israel came to be. There are also many historical allusions, making references to the beginning of humanity. So in Genesis chapter 4, verse 20 to 22. The giant race, as you guys know, called the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. And the foundations of ancient cities in Genesis chapter 10, verse 10 to 12. Now, as you can see, in these specific texts, the hero isn't just a single character. The heroes are a series of individuals. And usually epics do that. You can have a hero being an individual character, but you can have a hero being also a group of people that represent a single character. in Genesis chapter 1 to 11, we see this being done with early humanity. So the hero in Genesis 1 to 11 is humanity in general. Moving on is Genesis 12 to 36, which is an example of what we call an ancestral epic. What do I need to say here? Okay, we see God's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, which predicts Israel's future destiny of being God's instrument of being a blessing to the whole world. And although it's not that common, there are still some supernatural elements. For example, God participating in the stories, appearing to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The destruction of Sodom, the miraculous birth from Sarah, and when Lot is saved by angels, and Jacob's very, very mysterious wrestling match with God. There are definitely some supernatural elements there. And similar to the cosmic epics, within the ancestral epics as well, there are 4 different heroes, but actually they all serve to represent one hero. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, these are like the 4 main stories in Genesis chapter 12 and onwards, but they can be seen as being one hero, which is how Israel came to be. Yep, okay, so moving on is what we call prophet stories. And this is a bit different to heroic narratives, but we're going to kind of look at both heroic narratives and prophet stories as one. And then we'll see how to apply and interpret both these two. So prophet stories, as you guys can guess by the name, prophet stories are stories of the events of the life of a prophet, usually those who lived a very good and godly, obedient life to God, and it kind of is encouraging readers to imitate the lifestyle of these certain prophets. But they also have another thing. So the first purpose is edifying and encouraging readers to live like these prophets. And the second is to rebuke the political and religious system that the prophets themselves were living in during that time period. It'll be even more clearer when I explain this. For example, the stories of Elijah and Elisha in the book of Daniel as well are very good examples of this case. In Elijah and Elisha's case, these 2 prophets model an example of what perseverance looks like while facing political pressure. And they also boldly challenge the leaders who are oppressing them. Yes. So that's Elijah and Elisha's case. In Daniel's case, Daniel kind of shows how the Israelites should be faithful to God in the presence of pressures from foreign lords like King Nebuchadnezzar, and models what it looks like to have an unwavering confidence in God's sovereign protection of his people. So that's the lesson that the original audience would have taken from that. But at the same time, the book of Daniel also is a powerful rebuke to foreign nations who are very self-deluded and think that they are very powerful and prideful. The book of Jonah is also an example of a prophet story, but unlike Daniel and Elisha and Elijah's case, it's kind of like the opposite. It's like, don't be like Jonah, and be like don't be like Jonah, and be like the people who Jonah was not like the foreign people who worship God on the boat. As we see, prophet stories in these examples, they serve 2 purposes: to edify and encourage us to imitate the prophet's lifestyle, and number 2, to rebuke how the religious lifestyle of the people of that time were living was how it was wrong. So two purposes: encouragement to live in a certain way, and the rebuke of the religious and political system. So then, with heroic narratives and prophet stories, how should we read them? How should we interpret them? And how should we apply them? A couple of steps. Step number 1 is focus on the life of the main character, whether that be the hero or the prophet. Again, it could be an individual, it could be a family, or it could even be the nation of Israel itself. And as you read through these heroic stories, heroic narratives and prophet stories, we should consider 2 questions. 1, how does the main character's life model a relationship with God and with other people? And 2, what aspect of the original writer or reader's worldview does the story seek to critique or rebuke? So basically, it's like, how does the main character live, and how can we learn from that? And then, how does the author rebuke the different religious and political systems of their day, and how does it apply to our lives today? Step 2 then is ask yourself, what value does the hero or the prophet represent? For example, several passages talk about how Abraham is an example of persistent faith. And so he shows the kind of trust in God that is expected of ancient Israel as well as Christians today. We should also ask ourselves, how do the values that the heroes or the prophets display challenge and seek to reshape the values that were popular back in the biblical times as well as the values of today? Step 3 is, other than the values, try to find out what the large themes are. For example, through the life of Elisha, we see Israel's rejection of God in favor of the idol Baal. While in Daniel's life, we see the challenges of remaining faithful and loyal to God in the face of strong cultural pressures. It's a large major theme. So in both cases, what we can learn is the importance of loyalty and faithfulness to obedience to God, and how at times God's people will have to be challenged and fight against any leadership that promotes other values other than God. So those are 3 steps for interpretation. The final step, which is the most important, is application. How do we apply this? In regards to application, other than imitating the values or the conduct or the lifestyles that the certain prophets and heroes represented, we should also focus on similar situations between the biblical characters and Christians today. For example, one theme in the Ancestral Epics that we took a look at before is that God miraculously overcomes infertility. An example is Genesis chapter 21, where God basically allows the line of Abraham to continue to keep his promise. But the application should not be, okay, God is always going to give his people children. Because a lot of people interpret it like that. They say, God gave Sarah, or Abraham's wife Sarah, even though she was infertile, God allowed an infertile woman such as Abraham's wife Sarah, a miraculous child. That the application from that shouldn't be, okay, that means God will always give his people children. In fact, for reasons only known to God, God might not allow some of his people to have children. And so a better analogy or situation then for us as Christians today is that the specific Ancestral Epic reminds us of God's firm commitment to carry out his salvation plan today. And so the response then should be that we should remain faithful to God instead of being unloyal or disobedient in times where we can't see God working in our lives. That should be the main takeaway. And this is a more reasonable application because it draws on a biblical truth that is relevant to all times instead of something that is subject to God's mysterious will about how God will prevent certain people from having babies or not. So that is one example. Another example is we can follow the case of Daniel to remain faithful to God even in the midst of political pressures. So that is how we should apply heroic stories and prophet stories. To put it simply, it's basically this. How can we imitate, what godly value or lifestyle do the prophets and heroes represent? What does it look like for us to apply that in our life today? That's one way we can apply heroic stories and prophet stories. The other way is, what is the author rebuking? What social, religious, political structure is the author rebuking? Or what worldview is the author rebuking? And what does that look like for today? What is a similar situation of the worldview being rebuked? And that's something that we can apply through these 2 different cases. So that's pretty much heroic stories and prophet stories. The next genre is what we call a comedy. Who likes comedy? It's probably not the kind of comedy that the Bible kind of talks about. Comedy is not just humor. Comedy is a genre that is basically a narrative as well, where there's usually a very dramatic happy ending. A common feature of comedies is to use very interesting characters like buffoons, clowns, fools, tricksters, like these kind of unique characters, and usually they create with these characters very ridiculous satire or irony. Comedies often end with a very dramatic ending, such as marriages, festivals, reconciliation with enemies, and victory over enemies. Now, what are some examples of comedy? The book of Esther is an example of comedy. There's a very clear plot that goes from tragedy into triumph, and thematically it also critiques the self-deluded rulers and empires of her day. The story of Joseph is also another example of comedy, Genesis 37 to 50. There is extreme tragedy in Joseph's life when he's exiled from his family, and then he's imprisoned in Egypt, but then the plot ends in a very big triumph. Joseph becomes basically the prime minister of his day, and he saves Egypt as well as his own family, and he's also reconciled with his brothers who initially betrayed him. So that's comedy. How then should we interpret and apply comedy? A couple of steps. Step one is find out how the tragedy turns into a triumph. So for Joseph and Esther's case, we should try to trace how Joseph and Esther save Israel from the different tragedies that they're facing. Step two, pay attention to character development. Note down the different character traits of both the heroes and the villains and how they contribute to either the success or the failures of the story. Also, take a look at how, if there are any kind of positive or negative development in characters. For example, Esther goes from being a very reluctant person to a bold, courageous leader. Or in regards to Joseph's brother's case, see which brother fits the story as a hero and which brother fits the story as a villain. Step three, discern what God's role is in the story, either a direct or indirect intervention. Ask yourselves, how does the author view accidents and coincidences? Is it God working the back, or is it just coincidence? Step four is try to find out what the main themes of a comedy are. For example, in Joseph's story, the clear theme is that God guides Joseph's ups and downs to preserve Israel's existence, being faithful to the promise that he made to Abraham. Esther is a bit more subtle, but a major theme in Esther would be God preserving his people in the face of oppressive nations and rulers. And finally, for application, what do we do? The most important. Application of comedy should come from what the comedy's main themes are. So for example, in both Joseph and Esther's case, a very key biblical truth is that God takes care of his people, and whatever hardship they face and wherever they are, God will always take care of his people. But we also need to keep in mind that these dramatic reversals in the book of Esther and story of Joseph aren't promises of divine intervention whenever we too face these kinds of situations. So what we need to be careful is this. Okay, the main theme of these two books is that God will protect his people no matter what. But the understanding of protection shouldn't be the same as what happened in Joseph's case and Esther's case. It should just be the principle itself that God always takes care of his people regardless of persecution. And so for Christians today, how we can apply that is that God secures our salvation even in the face of difficulties. And so we should be encouraged then to be faithful in the face of persecution. Yep. Now, the final one that I want to talk about in Old Testament narratives, final genre, very briefly, is called the farewell speech. Bye-bye, farewell speech. The farewell speech is basically when a person gives a report right after his or her death or shortly afterwards. Usually the speaker refers to his or her old age and how they're close to death and how they want to encourage their listeners to live in a certain way. And these leaders are usually great leaders of story, and their death usually marks a very important turning point for the group of people that are listening. For example, Moses. When Moses gives his final speech before he dies in the book of Deuteronomy, he's kind of giving like his ethical will, telling the Israelites how to live after he dies. Farewell speeches. So then, how do we interpret and apply farewell speeches? Step 1. Find out what makes the occasion of the speech historically important. Why did the speaker give the speech? What situation led to the point of this speaker to give this speech before he or she died? Step 2, find out what the aging leader's concerns are. What is he or she urging his audience to do? Step 3, it's decide what the given speech or how the given speech contributes to the larger theme of the surrounding book. For example, how does Samuel's speech in 1 Samuel 12, before he dies, develops the themes of the book of 2 Samuel in the sequel. And finally, and most importantly, for application-wise, find out the application should come mainly from the historical setting of the speech, the context of the speech, as well as what the speech's main point is. So, as we read through these farewell speeches, we should then think about what are some similar situations that we are in as the audiences. So when Moses gives his final speech to the Israelites, what are some similar situations, historical situations that are relevant to us? Or when Samuel gives his final speech before he dies, what are some similar settings to us as well? For example, Samuel's final words encourage his original audience to serve God faithfully, even in the midst of facing attack and offense from unbelievers. And so for us as Christians then is, okay, when are we faced with attacks from non-believers? And how can we stay faithful, like how Samuel told his people to stay faithful in the midst of this persecution? That's it. It's a lot, but I encourage you guys to rewatch the recording to kind of get a bit more understanding of these things. But essentially, it's this. There are a lot of stories in the Old Testament, and the key principle is God doesn't tell these stories for no reasons. He tells these stories because there are certain principles that he wants us to take away from it. Oftentimes, in order for us to understand what that point is, we need to read the whole book, like in the book of Kings or Chronicles. Oftentimes, we can find that out immediately, like in dream visions and whatnot. But the point is that we need to put in the effort to figure out, why is God telling us this story? What does he want us to take away from these different stories? And then we apply that to our lives. Okay, any questions about all this? Clarity or anything? Comments, concerns, questions?